Russia spent years building up its military infrastructure, but in a trio of strikes, Ukraine destroyed it all in a heartbeat, as it unleashed a triple strike combo that used weapons from the US, UK, and its own long-range arsenal. This was a huge set of strikes. A record number of Russian weapons have been wiped off the map, and Putin will never get them back. And according to Ukraine, this could be happening a lot more often if it just had a small helping hand from its allies. We'll cover the strikes first, then we'll explain what Kyiv believes could help it to break more records in the future. On March 9th, the Kyiv Post published an in-depth report on the three-punch combo that Ukraine delivered to Russia, starting from March 6th and going into March 8th. A trio of strikes, all against facilities that Russia has set up in the occupied territories of Ukraine, absolutely dismantled Russia's long-range drone strategy by taking out sites that are essential to Putin's use of Shahed-type attack drones. This was a case of Ukraine shooting the archer rather than shooting the arrows, as it decided to take down the drones at their source rather than trying to intercept them after Russia had fired them. And the best part about it all is that Ukraine unleashed one of its new weapons alongside one of the most powerful weapons that the US and UK have delivered to make these strikes happen. First, we head into the Donetsk region of Ukraine, a target for Putin ever since he launched his invasion, in no small part because there are billions, if not trillions of dollars of mineral wealth in the region. Occupied Donetsk was rocked with a massive wave of strikes on the night leading into March 7th. Building interiors were blown out, secondary explosions triggered, setting fires and destroying industrial buildings close to the Donetsk airport. Ukraine's target during the first wave of strikes was the sites that the armed forces of Ukraine claim that Russia has been using to launch Shahed drones into Ukraine since at least 2024. The Kyiv Independent also reported on the strikes. It says that Ukraine unleashed a lethal combination of American-made ATACMS missiles alongside Storm Shadow or Scalp missiles, which come from the UK and France, to destroy its target. Today, ATACMS and Scalp missiles struck a site near Donetsk airport used by the enemy for the storage, preparation, and launch of Shahed-type strike UAVs, the General Staff of Ukraine's armed forces announced on Telegram, adding, "The strike was carried out by units of the missile forces and artillery of the Ukrainian land forces in coordination with aircraft of the Ukrainian Air Force." The post was accompanied by a video, seemingly shot by a reconnaissance drone, which recorded the insane impacts made by these Western weapons. Shots are fired. Missiles land, and all that's left of the targets is rubble on the ground as black smoke streams into the sky. Other images have since emerged of destroyed buildings at Donetsk airport and yet more smoke rising into the sky, well into the daylight hours. All of this tells us that Russia had no answer for what Ukraine unleashed. Its air defenses were penetrated with ease, allowing Ukraine to take out a launch site that Russia has been using to launch its own waves of drone strikes against Ukrainian territory. Don't underestimate just how important strikes like these are to Ukraine's ability to defend itself against Russia. As United 24 media reported on March 2nd, Russia deployed 5,059 long-range drones against Ukraine in February alone, which represents a 13% increase in the number of drones launched in January. On March 10th, Business Insider noted that Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has claimed that Ukraine has had to deal with more than 57,000 Shahed or Shahed-type drones that Russia has launched at its cities, infrastructure, and troops since Putin invaded. That amounts to a rough average of over 1,187 drones per month, though we have seen the size and scale of Russia's drone assaults increase dramatically since about halfway through 2025. With those numbers in mind, it's clear what Ukraine's game plan was with its first Donetsk strike. If you take out a launch site, you minimize Russia's ability to launch Shahed drones. Using Storm Shadow and ATACMS missiles also means the impact was so severe that Russia won't be repairing its sites anytime soon. Of course, this doesn't take Shahed drones off the table for Russia. But what it does mean is that Putin's forces have lost a launch site that was closer to the targets that Russia wants to hit than almost any other that it has. Future Shahed drones will have to travel larger distances, and more travel adds up to more chances for those drones to be taken out before they can do any damage. Did Russia acknowledge the Donetsk strike? I think we've all seen enough plays from the Russian propaganda playbook to know the answer to that question. Russia's defense ministry made no mention of all its Shahed launch sites in Donetsk going up in smoke, despite the clear evidence demonstrating what Ukraine pulled off. What the ministry did talk about was the 132 Ukrainian drones that it claims that Russian air defenses shot down over several regions of Russia on the same night of the Donetsk attack. Those regions, including Samara, Volgograd, and Saratov, all of which are a little too far away from Donetsk for Russia to pull out its usual drone debris excuse. Not that it would have worked. Storm Shadow and ATACMS missiles leave much larger craters than Ukraine's drones. We guess that when the go-to excuse can't be used, Russia defaults to pretending that nothing happened at all. Putin is an ostrich who buried his head in the sand while his tail feathers burn. And Ukraine was far from done with him or his forces in Donetsk. Ukraine had 2 more strikes up its sleeve. The third of these strikes struck another of the occupied territories so hard that it will have Putin crying into cabbage. Keep watching and we'll tell you exactly why. As for the second of these 3 strikes that Ukraine pulled off, you may have gotten a clue where Ukraine hit based on us telling you that the first strike we've covered was the first wave of attacks in Donetsk. Next up is the second wave, which also targeted Donetsk. This second wave, which Ukraine unleashed on March 8th, featured a new kind of domestically developed weapon that Ukraine has created specifically for this type of attack. The Pelican took flight, and it wreaked havoc on the ATACMS factory in the occupied region of Donetsk. Located west of the airport that Ukraine has shattered with Western missiles just hours before, this factory was struck during the early hours of sunrise, and with it went the maintenance and material storage facilities that Putin's forces had likely been using to support the Shahed launch site Ukraine had struck earlier. Yet more damage was done. Early images recorded in the city's central and northern districts showed black smoke rising hundreds of meters into the sky from an industrial region, the Kyiv Post reports. It adds that eyewitnesses near the scene reported hearing 2 massive blasts, which signifies just how powerful the weapon Ukraine used must have been. This was no standard long-range drone strike, which we have seen Ukraine pull off in Russia in the occupied territories many times in the past. The weapon that Ukraine used to take out ATACMS was strong enough to cause a massive fire at a facility that the Kyiv Post says some claim to have been used to store Shahed drones. And Ukraine wasn't done with this second round of strikes. It followed up on March 8 with a second attack on ATACMS, a double tap if you will, and one that was so powerful that it caused secondary explosions in the wake of the primary strike. The Kyiv Post adds that footage shot by one nearby resident shows a 3-story industrial building that had its center utterly demolished by the attack. The crumbling facade, all of the rubble, and the debris that had fallen off the building were all consistent with a powerful explosion that wasn't created by a drone. It was created by a Pelican. We're going to cover why that's so important in just a moment, but before we do, the use of Pelican missiles changes everything, and this is why we create the Military Show, to give you the full picture and not just the headlines. Hit subscribe if you're getting value from our videos and ensure that you stay ahead of the curve. So the Pelican, why does it matter? We could answer that quickly by telling you that the Pelican is a ballistic missile like the ATACMS. However, it's a ballistic missile that Ukraine has created itself, which means it isn't restricted to the same types of strikes that Ukraine carries out with its Western missile arsenal. When Ukraine uses Storm Shadow or ATACMS, it has to get permission before it can fire. That isn't the case with Pelican. Once it has a target in its sights, Ukraine can hit it hard and fast, long before Russia has even the slightest inkling of what's coming its way. That's what we saw on the ATACMS facility on March 8th. At least that's according to the Supernova Plus Telegram channel, which the Kyiv Post reports as claiming that Ukraine fired its FP-9 Pelican missiles into Donetsk in its follow-up attack on Russia's Shahed infrastructure. The sheer firepower this missile brings to such strikes is huge for Ukraine. A single Pelican can be packed with up to 850 kilograms, or a little over 1,870 pounds of high explosive, meaning it hits magnitudes harder than typical long-range drones, which do well to transport a tenth of the firepower to a target. Little is known about the Pelican, though United 24 media reported on March 9th in the wake of Ukraine's strike that it's believed that this new ballistic missile has a range of about 800 kilometers or 497 miles. That's a longer range than the Storm Shadow and ATACMS missiles Ukraine used in its first strike, and it hints at Ukraine having developed the missile to conduct strikes inside Russia, in addition to the occupied territories. As a ballistic missile with a high terminal speed, the Pelican is also very difficult for Russia's air defenses to intercept. We'd say that might be the reason why Russia didn't manage to muster any kind of response to Ukraine's use of its ballistic missiles in these 2 attacks. But that could just as easily be put down to Russia having limited air defenses left in Donetsk. Ukraine claims it has destroyed almost 1,330 Russian air defense systems since Putin launched his invasion, and the sheer scale of that destruction is starting to pay off by making strikes like the one that Ukraine just completed at ATACMS easier to pull off. But this is beside the point. The headline from the second Donetsk strike is that Ukraine has its own ballistic missiles now, and if the missile's manufacturer, Firepoint, is to be believed, it's a ballistic missile that can strike as deep as Moscow. Oh, and by the way, Ukraine hit more than ATACMS during its second wave of attacks. Ukraine's Special Operations Forces add that its operators had also taken part in a special operation that resulted in the destruction of a trio of Pantsir S-1 air defense systems that were covering the routes that Ukraine's missiles used. Don't worry, we're getting to the knockout blow of the 3-punch combo. Before we do, does anyone want to take any guesses about how Russia acknowledged Ukraine's second strike against its Shahed facilities in less than 24 hours? If you answered, it didn't, then well done. All that Russia's defense ministry could muster up was a weak claim to have shot down at least 114 of Ukraine's drones over Donetsk, Crimea, Volgograd, Kaluga, and the Krasnodar. Russia also claims to have destroyed Ukrainian aircraft that it observed during the strikes, though there are no independent reports to back that claim up. The odds are that Russia hit no aircraft. It was too busy dealing with the burning remains of Shahed to do anything like that. And that brings us to the third of the Ukrainian combination of strikes. We've dropped a couple of hints about where this strike took place. Ukraine took aim at the village of Novozerna in the occupied Crimean peninsula at around the same time that it was destroying Shahed facilities in Donetsk. This time around, Ukraine hit a Navy port site near the village where it destroyed an armed patrol boat, which is yet another shot to the ailing Black Sea fleet that has utterly failed to control the sea that gives the fleet its name. But far more importantly, Ukraine also struck the Kirovska airfield, which Russia's forces used to unleash Orion heavy strike drones on Ukraine. All told, Ukraine took out 4 control stations for these powerful drones in its attack on Crimea, along with hitting the launch site itself, the Kyiv Post reports. Plus, as we saw in Donetsk, Ukraine struck twice in Crimea. On March 6th, the Kyiv Independent reported that Ukraine's long-range drones were at it again. They struck the production workshops of the Yevpatoria aircraft repair plant, the outlet says, as well as hitting a pair of Pantsir S-2 air defense systems in Zankoy, which is in Crimea's northern region. We're starting to see a pattern here. It's one that's also played out in Donetsk. Ukraine is taking out air defense systems close to where it wants to strike. Once those systems are taken offline and the safe aerial corridors that Ukraine needs are established, missiles and powerful drones fly. It seems to be this approach that enabled the trio of attacks that we've seen Ukraine pull off over the last few days. And each time, Ukraine is costing Russia millions of dollars in air defense systems, only to follow up with strikes that cripple Russia's long-range strategy. Shahed and Orion drones have been taken out of the skies because their launch sites are up in smoke. That means less pressure on Ukraine's defenders, and less pressure means that those defenders can focus on the important task of dealing with Russia's soldiers on the ground. That alone would be enough reason for Ukraine to have carried out these 3 strikes. Anything that the country can do to mitigate the long-range drone menace presented by Putin's barbaric forces is good for Ukraine. And the fact that at least one of these strikes has been conducted using a ballistic missile that was built in Ukraine tells us that the country is preparing for a future long-range strategy that isn't dictated by anybody else and will allow it to hit Russia harder than it's ever hit before. But there's something else that's interesting about Ukraine's recent hat-trick. It has something to do with the Western missiles that Ukraine used, as the Kyiv Post explains. It says that the strikes using ATACMS and Storm Shadow marked the first time the AFU claimed it had used British Storm Shadows and US-made ATACMS in a complex attack. In other words, Ukraine's usage of these weapons in the past has seen them launched in isolation against their targets. But this time around, Ukraine used its Western missiles in conjunction with its long-range drones in a more complex type of attack that mimics what Russia tries to pull off with its combined Shahed and missile assaults. Perhaps Russia's defense ministry is telling the truth about the hundreds of drones that it claimed to have shot down as Ukraine's missiles reached their targets. Those drones may have been sent with the specific goal of confusing Russia's remaining air defenses, forcing the focus to be placed somewhere other than the paths of the powerful missiles that were streaking toward the key sites in occupied Donetsk and Crimea. But that's speculation. But Putin and his cronies will be asking questions about how all of this happened and why Russia was unable to stop any of Ukraine's missiles. As for what the future holds for Ukraine, you may remember that we told you that we would explain what Ukraine believes it needs to break even more records with its long-range strikes in the future. Ukraine has made itself clear several times already. More Western missiles lead to more of Russia's key military nodes being destroyed. What Ukraine did between March 6th and 8th is just a small sample of the pain that it could inflict on Putin and his military if the shackles were removed. More missiles combined with no more restrictions on the strikes that Ukraine can carry out using Western weapons would be all that Ukraine needs to turn missiles like the Storm Shadow and the ATACMS from damage dealers into true game changers. Unfortunately for Ukraine, the collective West still hesitates. Despite requests made to the likes of the US, UK, France, and even Germany, the providers of the missiles that Ukraine used for at least one of the strikes we've covered are wary of going further. They don't want to escalate tensions with Russia, so they won't supply their missiles in high enough quantities to do far more severe damage than we've already seen. That's a difficult pill for Ukraine to swallow. But it will keep on pushing for more, and with the development of Pelican and other long-range weapons, it will also make up for what some in the country see as lackluster support from the West. Expansion is on Ukraine's mind, according to David Kirichenko in a March 10th article for Forbes. And that expansion of its long-range campaign is precisely what we're going to see from Ukraine as we move deeper into 2026. Kirichenko points out that we've already seen Ukraine strike as deep as 1,300 kilometers, or almost 807 miles into Russia this year. He adds that Ukraine is now striking Russia deeper into its own territory using weapons that pack more power than the long-range drones it's used in the past. Millions of dollars have been invested into a domestic missile industry that is bearing fruit with weapons like the Pelican that just wrecked Russia. More will be coming. Whether that includes more Western missiles as Ukraine hopes or not, Putin has been put on notice. Everything that Russia has that is within 1,000 miles of Ukraine has become a target. This time around, it was the Shahed facilities in the occupied regions of Ukraine. But next time, Ukraine's domestic ballistic missiles and drone cruise missile hybrids may search for even bigger prey inside Russia itself. Right now, Ukraine seems to be making a habit of taking out parts of Putin's war machine that Russia's president won't be able to replace. About a month before these most recent strikes, Ukraine unleashed a hellstorm inside Russia that took out key energy sites, oil infrastructure, and more. Go check out our video if you want to learn more about those strikes, and if you enjoyed this video, remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more coverage of how Ukraine is ruining Putin's war plans with its long-range strategy. And thank you as always for watching.